Consciousness is, among other things, a spontaneous exercise in creativity. You are learning now, in a three-dimensional context, the ways in which your emotional and psychic existence can create varieties of physical form. You manipulate within the psychic environment, and these manipulations are then automatically impressed upon the physical mold. Now, our environment is in itself creative in a different manner than yours. Your environment is creative in that the trees bear fruit, that there is a self-sustaining principle, that the earth feeds its own, for example. The naturally creative aspects are the materializations of the deepest psychic, spiritual, and physical inclinations of the species, set up in your terms eons ago, and a part of the racial bank of psychic knowledge. We endow the elements of our environment with an even greater creativity that is difficult to explain. We do not have flowers that grow, for example, but the intensity, the condensed psychic strength of our psychological natures forms new dimensions of activity. If you paint a picture within three-dimensional existence, then the painting must be on a flat surface, merely hinting at the complete three-dimensional experience that you can insert into it. In our environment, however, we could actually create whatever dimensional effects we desired. All of these abilities are not ours alone. They are your heritage. As you will see later in this book, you exercise your own inner senses and multidimensional abilities more frequently than it might seem in other states of consciousness than the normal waking one. Since my own environment does not have easily defined physical elements, you will be able to understand its nature by inference. As I explain some related topics throughout this book, your own physical environment appears as it does to you because of your own psychological structure. If you gained your sense of personal continuity through associative processes primarily, rather than as a result of the familiarity of self moving through time, then you would experience physical reality in an entirely different fashion. Objects from past and present could be perceived at once, their presence justified through associative connections. Say that your father, throughout his lifetime, has 8 favorite chairs. If your perceptive mechanisms were primarily set up as a result of intuitive association rather than time sequence, then you would perceive all of these chairs at one time. Or, seeing one, you would be aware of the others. So environment is not a separate thing in itself, but the result of perceptive patterns, and these are determined by psychological structure. So if you want to know what my environment is like, you will have to understand what I am. In order to explain, I shall have to speak about the nature of consciousness in general. In doing so, I shall end up telling you much about yourself. The inner portions of your identity are already aware of much that I will tell you. Part of my purpose is to acquaint your egotistical self with knowledge that is already known to a larger portion of your own consciousness that you have long ignored. You look out into the physical universe and interpret reality according to the information received from your outer senses. I will stand, figuratively speaking, in physical reality and look inward for you and describe those realities of consciousness and experience that you are presently too fascinated to see. For you are fascinated with physical reality, and you are in as deep a trance now as the woman through whom I write this book. All of your attention is focused in a highly specialized way upon one shining, bright point that you call reality. There are other realities all about you, but you ignore their existence, and you blot out all stimuli that comes from them. There is a reason for such a trance, as you will discover, but little by little, you must wake up. My purpose is to open your inner eyes. My environment includes, of course, those other personalities with whom I come in contact. Communication, perception, and environment can hardly be separated. Therefore, the kind of communication that is carried on by myself and my associates is extremely important in any discussion of our environment. In the following chapter, I hope to give you an idea, quite simply, of our existence, the work in which we are involved, the dimension in which we exist, the purposes that we hold dear, and most of all, of those concerns that make up our experience. Chapter 3. My work and those dimensions of reality into which it takes me. Now I have friends even as you do, though my friends may be of longer standing. You must understand that we experience our own reality in quite a different manner than you do. We are aware of what you would call our past selves, those personalities we have adopted in various other existences. Because we use telepathy, we can hide little from each other, even if we wish to. This, I am sure, seems an invasion of privacy to you. And yet I assure you that even now none of your thoughts are hidden, but are known quite clearly to your family and friends. And I may add, unfortunately, to those you consider enemies as well. You are simply not aware of this fact. This does not mean that each of us is like an open book to the other. Quite the contrary. There is such a thing as mental etiquette, mental manners. We are much more aware of our own thoughts than you are. We realize our freedom to choose our thoughts, and we choose them with some discrimination and finesse. The power of our thoughts has been made clear to us through trial and error in other existences. We have discovered that no one can escape the vast creativity of the mental image or of emotion. This does not mean that we are not spontaneous, or that we must deliberate between one thought or another in anxious concern that one might be negative or destructive. That, in your terms, is behind us. Our psychological structure does mean that we can communicate in far more various forms than those with which you are familiar, however. Pretend, for example, that you meet a childhood friend whom you have long forgotten. Now, you may have little in common, yet you may have a fine afternoon's discussion centered about old teachers and classmates and establish a certain rapport. So when I meet another, I may be able to relate to him much better on the basis of a particular past life experience, even though in my now we have little in common. We may have known each other, for example, as entirely different people in the 14th century, and we may communicate very nicely by discussing those experiences, much as you and your hypothetical childhood friend established rapport by remembering your past. We will be quite aware that we are ourselves, however, the multidimensional personalities who shared a more or less common environment at one level of our existence. As you will see, this analogy is a rather simple one that will only do for now, because past, present, and future do not really exist in those terms. Our experience, however, does not include the time divisions with which you are familiar. We have far more friends and associates than you do, simply because we are aware of varying connections in what we call, for now, past incarnations. We have, of course, therefore, more knowledge at our fingertips, so to speak. There is no period of time in your terms that you can mention, but some of us have been from there and carry within our memories the indelible experience that was gained in that particular context. We do not feel the need to hide our emotions or thoughts from others, because all of us by now well recognize the cooperative nature of all consciousness and reality, and our part in it. We are highly motivated. Could spirits be anything else? Simply because we have at our command the full use of our energy, it is not diverted into conflicts. We do not fritter it away, but utilize it for those unique and individual purposes that are a basic part of our psychological experience. Now, each whole self or multidimensional personality has its own purposes, missions, and creative endeavors that are initial and basic parts of itself, and that determine those qualities that make it eternally valid and eternally seeking. We are finally free to utilize our energy in those directions. We face many challenges of quite momentous nature, and we realize that our purposes are not only important in themselves, but for the surprising offshoots that develop in our efforts to pursue them. In working for our purposes, we realize we are blazing trails that can be used by others. We also suspect, certainly I do, that the purposes themselves will have surprising results, astounding consequences that we have never realized, and that they will merely lead to new avenues. Realizing this helps us keep a sense of humor. When one has been born and died many times, expecting extinction with each death, and when this experience is followed by the realization that existence still continues, then a sense of the divine comedy enters in. We are beginning to learn the creative joy of play. I believe, for example, that all creativity and consciousness is born in the quality of play, as opposed to work, in the quickened, intuitional spontaneity that I see as a constant through all my own existences and in the experience of those I know. I communicate with your dimension, for example, not by willing myself to your level of reality, but by imagining myself there. All of my deaths would have been adventures had I realized what I know now. On the one hand, you take life too seriously, and on the other hand, you do not take playful existence seriously enough. We enjoy a sense of play that is highly spontaneous, and yet I suppose you would call it responsible play. Certainly, it is creative play. We play, for example, with the mobility of our consciousness, seeing how far one can send it. We are constantly surprised at the products of our own consciousness, of the dimensions of reality through which we can hopscotch. It might seem that we use our consciousness idly in such play, and yet again, the pathways we make continue to exist and can be used by others. We leave messages to any whom come by, mental signpost. We can be highly motivated, therefore, and yet use and understand the creative use of play, both as a method of attaining our goals and purposes, and as a surprising and creative endeavor in itself. Now, in my work as a teacher, I travel into many dimensions of existence, even as a traveling professor might give lectures in various states or countries. Here, however, the resemblance ends, since before I can begin to work, I must set up preliminary psychological structures and learn to know my pupils before teaching can even begin. I must have a thorough knowledge of the particular system of reality in which my pupil operates, of his or her system of thought, of the symbols that are meaningful. The stability of the pupil's personality must be correctly gauged by me. The needs of that personality cannot be ignored, but must be taken into consideration. The pupil must be encouraged, but not overly extended, while development continues. My material must be presented in such a way that it makes sense in the context in which the pupil understands reality, particularly in the early stages. Great care must be utilized, even before serious learning can begin, that all levels of the personality develop at a more or less constant rate. Often the material I present will initially be given without any sign of my presence, seemingly as a startling revelation, for no matter how carefully I present the material, it is still bound to change past ideas that are strongly a part of the pupil's personality. What I say is one thing, but the pupil, of course, is thrust into psychological and psychic behavior and experience that may seem quite alien to him on a conscious level. The problems vary according to the system in which my pupil has his or her existence. In your system, for example, and in connection with the women through whom I now write this book, initial contact on my part was made long before our sessions began. The personality was never consciously aware of the initial meeting. She simply experienced sudden new thoughts, and since she is a poet, these appeared as poetic inspirations. At one time, some years ago, at a writers' conference, she became involved in circumstances that could have led to her psychic development before she was ready. The psychological climate at that time of those involved initiated the conditions, and without realizing what she was about, our friend Jane went into a trance. I had known of her psychic gifts since her childhood, but the insights necessary were channeled through the poetry until the personality attained the necessary background that was needed in this particular case. In the affair just mentioned, therefore, I was informed and saw to it that the episode ended and was not pursued. It was hardly an accidental performance, however. Quite without knowing it, the personality decided to try its wings, figuratively speaking. As a part of my work, therefore, I have been coaching the young woman in one way or another since her childhood, and all of this as a preliminary to the serious work that began with our sessions. This is a normal part of my activity in many levels of existence. It is highly diversified work, for the personality structures vary. While within the systems in which I work, there are certain basic similarities. In some dimensions, I would not be equipped to be a teacher, simply because the basic concepts of experience would be alien to my nature, and the learning processes themselves outside of my own experience. Now, your ideas of space are highly erroneous, so in my contacts with your sphere of activity, I do not sweep through bright golden skies like some spiritual Superman into your physical domain. I will go into this in a later chapter, but in a very real manner, space as you perceive it simply does not exist. Not only is the illusion of space caused by your physical perceptive mechanisms, but it is also caused by mental patterns that you have accepted. Patterns that are adopted by consciousness when it reaches a certain stage of evolution within your system. When you arrive or emerge into physical life, not only is your mind not a blank slate waiting for the scrolls that experience will write upon it, but you are already equipped with a memory bank far surpassing that of any computer. You faced your first day upon the planet with skills and abilities already built in, though they may or may not be used, and they are not merely the result of heredity as you think of it. You may think of your soul or entity, though only briefly, and for the sake of this analogy, as some conscious and living, divinely inspired computer, who programs its own existences and lifetimes. But this computer is so highly endowed with creativity that each of the various personalities it programs springs into consciousness and song, and in turn create realities that may have been undreamed of by the computer itself. Each such personality, however, comes with a built-in idea of the reality in which it will operate, and its mental equipment is highly tailored to meet very specialized environments. It has full freedom, but it must operate within the context of existence to which it has been programmed. Within the personality, however, in the most secret recesses, is the condensed knowledge that resides in the computer as a whole. I must emphasize that I am not saying that the soul or entity is a computer, but only asking you to look at the matter in this light in order to make several points clear. Each personality has within it the ability not only to gain a new type of existence in the environment, in your case in physical reality, but to add creatively to the very quality of its own consciousness, and in so doing to work its way through the specialized system, breaking the barriers of reality as it knows it. Now, there is a purpose in all this that will also be discussed later. I mention this whole subject here, however, because I want you to see that your environment is not real in the terms that you imagine it to be. When you are born, then, you are already conditioned to perceive reality in a particular manner and to interpret experience in a very limited but intense range. I must explain this before I can clearly give you an idea of my environment or of those other systems of reality in which I operate. I must explain this before I can clearly give you an idea of my environment or of those other systems of reality in which I operate. There is no space between my environment and yours, for example. No physical boundaries that separate us. In a very real way of speaking, your concept of reality, as seen through your physical senses, scientific instruments, or arrived at through deduction, bears little resemblance to the facts, and the facts are difficult to explain. Your planetary systems exist at once, simultaneously, both in time and in space. The universe that you seem to perceive, either visually or through instruments, appears to be composed of galaxies, stars, and planets at various distances from you. Basically, however, this is an illusion. Your senses and your very existence as physical creatures program you to perceive the universe in such a way. The universe as you know it is your interpretation of events as they intrude upon your three-dimensional reality. The events are mental. This does not mean that you cannot travel to other planets, for example, within that physical universe, any more than it means that you cannot use tables to hold books, glasses, and oranges, although the table has no solid qualities of its own. When I enter your system, I move through a series of mental and psychic events. You would interpret these events as space and time, and so often I must use the terms, for I must use your language rather than my own. Root assumptions are those built-in ideas of reality of which I spoke, those agreements upon which you base your ideas of existence. Space and time, for example, are root assumptions. Each system of reality has its own set of such agreements. When I communicate within your system, I must use and understand the root assumptions upon which it is based. As a teacher, it is part of my job to understand and use these, and I have had existences in many such systems as a part of what you may call my basic training. Though, in your terms, my associates and I had other names for them. The entity or the soul has a far more creative and complicated nature than even your religions have ever granted it. It utilizes numberless methods of perception, and it has at its command many other kinds of consciousness. Your idea of the soul is indeed limited by your three-dimensional concepts. The soul can change the focus of its consciousness and uses consciousness as you use the eyes in your head. Now, in my level of existence, I am simply aware of the fact, strange as it may seem, that I am not my consciousness. My consciousness is an attribute to be used by me. This applies to each of the readers of this book, even though the knowledge may be hidden. Soul, or entity, then, is more than consciousness. When I enter your environment, I turn my consciousness in your direction, therefore. In one way, I translate what I am into an event that you can understand to some extent. In a much more limited manner, any artist does the same thing when he translates what he is, or a portion of it, into a painting. There is at least an evocative analogy there. When I enter your system, I intrude into three-dimensional reality, and you must interpret what happens in the light of your own root assumptions. Now, whether or not you realize it, each of you intrudes into other systems of reality in your dream states without the full participation of your normally conscious self. In subjective experience, you leave behind physical existence and act at times with strong purpose and creative validity within dreams that you forget the instant you awaken. When you think of the purpose of your existence, you think in terms of daily, waking life, but you also work at your purpose in these other dream dimensions, and you are then in communication with other portions of your own entity, at work at endeavors quite as valid as those you're about in waking life. When I contact your reality, therefore, it is as if I were entering one of your dreams. I can be aware of myself as I dictate this book through Jane Roberts, and yet also be aware of myself in my own environment. For I send only a portion of myself here, as you perhaps send out a portion of your consciousness as you write a letter to a friend, and yet are aware of the room in which you sit. I send out much more than you do in a letter, for a portion of my consciousness is now within the entranced woman as I dictate, but the analogy is close enough. My environment, as I mentioned earlier, is not one of a personality recently dead in your terms, but later I will describe what you can expect under those conditions. One large difference between your environment and mine is that you must physically materialize mental acts as physical matter. We understand the reality of mental acts and recognize their brilliant validity. We accept them for what they are, and therefore we are beyond the necessity to materialize them and interpret them in such a rigid manner. Your earth was very dear to me. I can now turn the focus of my consciousness towards it, and if I choose, experience it as you do, but I can also perceive it in many ways that you cannot in your time. Now, some of you who read this book will immediately and intuitively grasp what I am saying, for you will have already suspected that you are viewing experience through highly distorted, though colorful, figurative lenses. Remember also that if physical reality is in a larger sense an illusion, it is an illusion caused by a greater reality. The illusion itself has a purpose and a meaning. Perhaps it is better to say that physical reality is one form that reality takes. In your system, however, you are focused much more intensely upon one relatively small aspect of experience. We can travel freely through varying numbers of such realities. Our experience at this point includes our work in each. I do not mean to minimize the importance of your present personalities, nor of physical existence. To the contrary, three-dimensional experience is an invaluable place of training. Your personality, as you now know it, will indeed persevere, and with its memories, but it is only a part of your entire identity. Even as your childhood in this life is an extremely important part of your present personality, though now you are far more than a child. You will continue to grow and develop, and you will become aware of other environments, even as you left your childhood home. But environments are not objective things, conglomerations of objects that exist independently of you. Instead, you form them, and they are quite literally extensions of yourself, materialized mental acts that extend outward from your consciousness. I will tell you exactly how you form your environment. I form mine following the same rules, though you end up with physical objects, and I do not. Your scientists are finally learning what philosophers have known for centuries, that mind can influence matter. They still have to discover the fact that mind creates and forms matter. Now, your closest environment, physically speaking, is your body. It is not like some mannequin shape in which you are imprisoned, that exist apart from you like a casing. Your body is not beautiful or ugly, healthy or deformed, swift or slow, simply because this is the kind of body that was thrust upon you indiscriminately at birth. Instead, your physical form, your corporeal personal environment, is the physical materialization of your own thoughts, emotions, and interpretations. Quite literally, the inner self forms the body by magically transforming thoughts and emotions into physical counterparts. You grow the body. Its condition perfectly mirrors your subjective state at any given time. Using atoms and molecules, you build your body, forming basic elements into a form that you call your own. You are intuitively aware that you form your image, and that you are independent of it. You do not realize that you create your larger environment and the physical world as you know it by propelling your thoughts and emotions into matter. a breakthrough into three-dimensional life. The inner self, therefore, individually and in mass, sends its psychic energy out, forming tentacles that coalesce into form. Each emotion and thought has its own electromagnetic reality, completely unique. It is highly equipped to combine with certain others, according to the various ranges of intensity that you may include. In a manner of speaking, three-dimensional objects are formed in somewhat the same way that the images you see on your television screen are formed, but with a large difference. And if you are not tuned into that particular frequency, you will not perceive the physical objects at all. Each of you act as transformers, unconsciously, automatically transforming highly sophisticated electromagnetic units into physical objects. You are in the middle of a matter-concentrated system, surrounded, so to speak, by weaker areas in which you would call pseudo-matter persist. Each thought and emotion spontaneously exist as a simple or complex electromagnetic unit, unperceived incidentally as yet by your scientists. The intensity determines both the strength and the permanency of the physical image into which the thought or emotion will be materialized. In my material, I am explaining this in depth. Here, I merely want you to understand that the world that you know is the reflection of an inner reality. You are made basically of the same ingredients as a chair, a stone, a head of lettuce, or a bird. In a gigantic cooperative endeavor, all consciousness joins together to make the forms that you perceive. Now, because this is known to us, we can change our environments and our own physical forms as we wish, and without confusion, for we perceive the reality that lies beneath. We also realize that permanency of form is an illusion, since all consciousness must be in a state of change. We can be, in your terms, in several places at once, because we realize the true mobility of consciousness. Now, whenever you think emotionally of another person, you send out a counterpart of yourself, beneath the intensity of matter, but a definite form. This form, projecting outward from your own consciousness, completely escapes your egotistical attention. When I think emotionally of someone else, I do the same thing, except that a portion of my consciousness is within the image and can communicate. Environments are primarily mental creations of consciousness, thrust out into many forms. I have a 14th century study, my favorite, with which I am very pleased, for example. In your physical terms, it does not exist, and I know quite well it is my mental production. Yet, I enjoy it, and often take a physical form in order to sit at the desk and look out the window at the countryside. Now you do the same thing when you sit in your living room, but you do not realize what you are doing, and presently you are somewhat restricted. When my associates and I meet, we often translate each other's thoughts into various shapes and forms out of pure enjoyment in the practice. We have what you might call a game, demanding some expertise, where, for our own amusement, we see which of us can translate any given thought into the most numerous forms. There are such subtle qualities affecting the nature of all thought, such emotional gradations, that no one is ever identical, and incidentally, no physical object in your system is an exact duplicate of any other. The atoms and molecules that compose it, any object, have their own identities that color and qualify any object that they form. You accept and perceive and focus upon continuities and similarities as you perceive physical objects of any kind. And in a very important manner, you shut out and ignore dissimilarities out of a given field of actuality. Therefore, you are highly discriminating, accepting certain qualities and ignoring others. Your bodies not only change completely every 7 years, for example, they change constantly with each breath. Within the flesh, atoms and molecules constantly die and are replaced. The hormones are in a constant state of motion and alteration. Electromagnetic properties of skin and cell continually leap and change and even reverse themselves. The physical matter that composed your body a moment ago is different in important ways from the matter that forms your body in this instant. If you perceived the constant change within your body with as much persistence as you attend to its seemingly permanent nature, then you would be amazed that you ever considered the body as one more or less constant, more or less cohesive entity. Even subjectively, you focus upon and indeed manufacture the idea of a relatively stable, relatively permanent conscious self. You stress those ideas and thoughts and attitudes that you recall from past experience as your own, completely ignoring those that once were characteristic and now are vanished, ignoring the fact also that you cannot hold thought. The thought of a moment before, in your terms, vanishes away. You try to maintain a constant, relatively permanent physical and subjective self in order to maintain a relatively constant, relatively permanent environment. So you are always in a position of ignoring such change. Those that you refuse to acknowledge are precisely those that would give you a much better understanding of the true nature of reality, individual subjectivity, and the physical environment that seems to surround you. What happens to a thought when it leaves your conscious mind? It does not simply disappear. You can learn to follow it, but you are usually frightened of turning your attention away from its intense focus in three-dimensional existence. Therefore, it seems that the thought disappears. It seems also that your subjectivity has a mysterious, unknown quality about it, and that even your mental life has a sort of insidious dropping-off point, a subjective cliff over which thoughts and memories fall, to disappear into nothingness. Therefore, to protect yourself, to protect your subjectivity from drifting, you erect various psychological barriers at what you suppose to be the danger points. Instead, you see, you can follow these thoughts and emotions simply by realizing that your own reality continues in another direction besides the one with which you mainly identify. For these thoughts and emotions that have left your conscious mind will lead you into other environments. These subjective openings through which thoughts seem to disappear are in fact like psychic warps connecting the self that you know with other universes of experience, realities where symbols come to life and thoughts are not denied their potential. There is communication between these other realities and your own in your dream states, and a constant interaction between both systems. If there is any point where your own consciousness seems to elude you or escape you, or if there is any point where your consciousness seems to end, then these are the points where you have yourselves set up psychological and psychic barriers. And these are precisely those areas that you should explore. Otherwise, you feel as if your consciousness is enclosed within your skull, immobile and constricted, and every lost thought or forgotten memory at least symbolically seems like a small death, and such is not the case. Chapter 4. Reincarnational Dramas. Your own environment includes far more than you may have supposed. Earlier, I referred to your environment in terms of the daily physical existence and surroundings with which you are currently connected. In actuality, you are aware of very little of your larger, more extensive environment. Consider your present self as an actor in a play. Hardly a new analogy, but a suitable one. The scene is set in the 20th century. You create the props, the settings, the themes. In fact, you write, produce, and act in the entire production. You and every other individual who takes part. You are so focused in your roles, however, so intrigued by the reality that you have created, so entranced by the problems, challenges, hopes, and sorrows of your particular roles that you have forgotten they are of your own creation. This intensely moving drama, with all of its joys and tragedies, can be compared with your present life, your present environment, both individually and en masse. But there are other plays going on simultaneously, in which you also have a part to play. These have their own scenery, their own props. They take place in different periods of time. One may be called life in the 12th century AD. One may be called life in the 18th century, or in 500 BC, or in AD 3000. You also create these plays and act in them. These settings also represent your environment, the environment that surrounds your entire personality. I am speaking of the portion of you who is taking part in this particular period piece, however, and that particular portion of your entire personality is so focused within this drama that you are not aware of the others in which you also play a role. You do not understand your own multidimensional reality. Therefore, it seems strange or unbelievable when I tell you that you live many existences at one time. These appearances, however, are a part of the complicated props that you have set up beforehand, and within the play you must accept them as real. 4 o'clock in the afternoon is a very handy reference. You can say to a friend, "I will meet you at 4 o'clock at the corner or at a restaurant for a drink or a chat or a meal," and your friend will know precisely where and when he will find you. If you attend the theater at 9 o'clock in the evening, but the actions of the play take place within the morning hours, and the actors are shown eating breakfast, you accept the time as given within the theater's play. You also pretend that it is morning. Each of you are now involved in a much larger production, in which you all agree on certain basic assumptions that serve as a framework within which the play can occur. The assumptions are that time is a series of moments one after another, that an objective world exists quite independently of your own creation and perception of it, that you are bound within the physical bodies that you have donned, and that you are limited by time and space. Other assumptions, accepted for the same reason, include the idea that all perception comes through your physical senses. In other words, that all information comes from without, and that no information can come from within. You therefore are forced to focus intensely upon the actions of the play. Now, these various plays, these creative period pieces, represent what you would call reincarnational lives. They all exist basically at one time. Those who are still involved in these highly complicated passion play seminars called reincarnational existences find it difficult to see beyond them. Some, resting between productions, as it were, try to communicate with those who are still taking part, but they themselves are merely in the wings, so to speak, and can only see so far. The plays seem to be taking place one before the other, and so these communications seem to intensify the false idea that time is a series of moments, passing in a single line from some inconceivable beginning to some equally inconceivable end. This leads you to think in terms of a very limited progress, both in individual terms and in terms of your species as a whole. You think, those of you who have even considered reincarnation, well, certainly the race must have progressed from the time of the Middle Ages, although you greatly fear it has not. Or you turn to technological progress and say, at least we have come a long way in that direction. You may smile and think to yourself that it is quite difficult to imagine a Roman senator addressing the multitudes through a microphone, for example, his children watching his performance on television. But all of this is highly misleading. Progress does not exist in the terms that you consider it to, any more than time does. In each play, both individually and in mass, different problems are set up. Progress can be measured in terms of the particular ways in which those problems were solved or not solved. Great advances have been made in certain periods. For example, great offshoots appeared that from your viewpoint you might not consider progress at all. In some plays, generally speaking, the actors are each working on a seemingly minute portion of a larger problem that the play itself is to resolve. Though I use the analogy here of a drama, these plays are highly spontaneous affairs in which the actors have full freedom within the play's framework. And granting these assumptions that have been stated, there are no rehearsals. There are observers, as you will see later in our book. As in any good theater production, there is an overall theme within each play. The great artist, for example, did not emerge out of a particular time simply because they were not born into it, or the conditions were favorable. The play itself was concerned with the actualization of intuitive truth into what you would call artistic form, with a creativity of such vast and sweeping results that it would serve to awaken latent abilities within each actor, and to serve as a model of behavior. Periods of Renaissance, spiritual, artistic, or psychic, occur because the intense inner focus of those involved in the drama are directed toward those ends. The challenge may be different in each play, but the great themes are beacons to all consciousness. They serve as models. Progress has nothing to do with time, you see, but with psychic and spiritual focus. Each play is entirely different from any other. It is not correct, therefore, to suppose that your actions in this life are caused by a previous existence, or that you are being punished in this life for crimes in a past one. The lives are simultaneous. Your own multidimensional personality is so endowed that it can have these experiences and still retain its identity. It is, of course, affected by those various plays in which it takes part. There is instant communication and an instant, if you prefer, feedback system. These plays are hardly without purpose. In them, the multidimensional personality learns through its own actions. It tries out an endless variety of poses, behavior patterns, attitudes, and changes others as a result. The word result, you see, automatically infers cause and effect. The cause happening before the effect. And this is simply one small example of the strength of such distortions, and of the inherent difficulties involved with verbal thought, for it always implies a single line delineation. You are the multidimensional self who has these existences, who creates and takes part in these cosmic passion plays, so to speak. It is only because you focus in this particular role now that you identify your entire being with it. You have set these rules for yourself for a reason. And consciousness is in a state of becoming, and so this multidimensional self of which I speak is not a psychological structure completed and done with. It is also in a state of becoming. It is learning the art of actualization. It has within it infinite sources of creativity, unlimited possibilities of development, but it has yet to learn the means of actualization, and must find within itself ways to bring into existence those untold creations that are within it. Therefore, it creates varieties of conditions in which to operate, and sets itself challenges, some doomed to failure, in your terms, at least initially, because it must first create the conditions which will bring new creations about. And all of this is done with great spontaneity and unbounded joy. You therefore create far more environments than you realize. Now, each actor, going about the role, focused within the play, has an inner guideline. He is not left, therefore, abandoned within a play that he has forgotten in his own creation. He has knowledge and information that comes to him through what I call the inner senses. He has other sources of information, therefore, than those strictly given within the confines of the production. Each actor knows this instinctively, and there are periods set and allowed for within the play itself in which each actor retires in order to refresh himself or herself. In these, she is informed through the inner senses of her other roles, and she realizes that she is far more than the self appearing in any given play. In these periods, she understands that she had her hand in the writing of the play, and she is freed from those assumptions that bind her while she is actively concerned with the drama's activities. These periods, of course, coincide with your sleep states and dreaming conditions, but there are also other times when each actor sees quite clearly that he is surrounded by props, and when his vision suddenly pierces the seeming reality of the production. This does not mean that the play is not real, or that it should not be taken seriously. It does mean playing a role, an important one. Each actor must of herself realize, however, the nature of the production and her part in it. She must actualize herself out of the three-dimensional confines of the play's setting. There is great cooperation behind such momentous productions, and in playing her role, each actor first actualizes herself within three-dimensional reality. The multidimensional self cannot act within three-dimensional reality until it materializes a portion of itself within it. Within this reality, it then brings about all kinds of creativity and development that could not appear otherwise. It must then propel itself from this system, however, through another act, another actualization on the part of itself that is three-dimensional. During its three-dimensional existence, it has helped others in ways that could not otherwise be helped, and it has been itself benefited and developed in ways that would be impossible otherwise. The meaning of the play is within you, therefore. It is only the conscious portion of you that acts so well and that is focused so securely within the props of the production. The purpose of any given life is available to you. The knowledge beneath the surface of the conscious self you know. All kinds of hints and clues are also available. You have the knowledge of your entire multidimensional personality at your fingertips. When you realize that you do, this knowledge allows you to solve the problems or meet the challenges you have set quicker in your terms, and also opens further areas of creativity by which the entire play or production can be enriched. To the extent, therefore, that you allow the intuitions and knowledge of the multidimensional self to flow through the conscious self, to that extent, not only do you perform your role in the play more effectively, but also you add new energy, insights, and creativity to the entire dimension. Now it seems to you, of course, that you are the only conscious part of yourself, for you are identifying with the actor in this particular production. The other portions of your multidimensional personality in these other reincarnational plays are also conscious, however, and because you are a multidimensional consciousness, you are also conscious in other realities besides these. Your multidimensional personality, your true identity, the real you, is conscious of itself, as itself, in any of these roles. These period pieces overall have a particular purpose. By the very nature of consciousness, it seeks to materialize itself in as many dimensions as possible, to create from itself new levels of awareness, new offshoots. In doing so, it creates all reality. Reality, therefore, is always in a state of becoming. The thoughts that you think, for example, in your actor's roles, are still completely unique and lead to new creativity. Certain aspects of your own consciousness could be fulfilled in no other way. When you think of reincarnation, you suppose a series of progressions. Instead, the various lives grow out of what your inner self is. They are not thrust upon you by some outside agency. They are a material development as your consciousness opens up and expresses itself in as many ways as possible. It is not restricted to one three-dimensional lifetime, nor is it restricted to one three-dimensional existence alone. Your consciousness then takes many forms, and these forms need not be alike any more, say, than a caterpillar is like a butterfly. The soul or entity has complete freedom of expression. It changes its form to suit its expression, and it forms environments like stage settings and worlds to suit its purposes. Each setting brings forth new developments. The soul or entity is highly individualized spiritual energy. It forms whatever body you now wear and is the motive power behind your physical survival, for from it you derive your vitality. Consciousness can never be still, but seeks further creativity. The soul, therefore, or entity, endows three-dimensional reality and the three-dimensional self with its own properties. The abilities of the entity lie within the three-dimensional self. The three-dimensional self, the actor, has access to this information and to these potentials. In learning to use these potentials, and learning to rediscover its relationship with the entity, the three-dimensional self raises still further the level of achievement, comprehension, and creativity. The three-dimensional self becomes more than it knows. Not only is the entity strengthened, but portions of it, having been actualized in three-dimensional existence, now add to the very quality and nature of that existence. Without this creativity, planetary life in your terms would always be sterile. The soul or entity then gives breath to the body and to the three-dimensional self within it. The three-dimensional self then goes about its purpose of opening up new areas of creativity. Entities or souls, in other words, send out portions of themselves to open up avenues of reality that would not otherwise exist. The three-dimensional selves, in existing within these realities, must focus their attention there completely. An inner awareness gives them a source of energy and strength. They must, however, come to understand their roles as actors. Finally, from their roles and through another act of comprehension, return to the entity. There are those who appear within these plays fully aware. These personalities willingly take roles, knowing that they are roles, in order to lead the others toward the necessary realization and development. They lead the actors to see beyond the selves and settings they have created. These personalities from other levels of existence oversee the play, so to speak, and appear among the actors. Their purpose is to open up within the three-dimensional selves those psychological doorways that will release the three-dimensional self for further development in another system of reality. You are learning to be co-creators. You are learning to be gods as you now understand the term. You are learning responsibility, the responsibility of any individualized consciousness. You are learning to handle the energy that is yourself for creative purposes. You will be bound to those you love and those you hate. though you will learn to release and lose and dissipate the hatred. You will learn to use even hatred creatively, and to turn it to the higher ends, to transform it, finally, into love. I will make this clearer in later chapters. The settings in your physical environment, the sometimes lovely paraphernalia, the physical aspects of life as you know it, are all camouflages, and so I call your physical reality a camouflage. Yet these camouflages are composed of the vitality of the universe. The rocks and stones and mountains and earth are living camouflage, interlocking psychic webs formed by minute consciousnesses that you cannot perceive as such. The atoms and molecules within them have their own consciousness, as do the atoms and molecules within your own body. Since you all have a hand in forming this physical setting, and since you are ensconced yourself in a physical form, then using the physical senses, you will only perceive this fantastic setting. The reality that exists both within it and beyond it will elude you. Even the actor is not entirely three-dimensional, however. He is part of a multidimensional self. Within him there are methods of perception that allow him to see through the camouflage settings, to see beyond the stage. He uses these inner senses constantly, though the actor part of himself is so intent upon the play that this escapes him. In a large manner, the physical senses actually form the physical reality they seem to only perceive. They are themselves part of the camouflage, but they are like lenses over your natural inner perceptions that force you to see an available field of activity as physical matter. And so they can be relied upon only to tell you what is happening in a superficial manner. You can tell the position of the other actors, for example, or time by clock, but these physical senses will not tell you that time is itself a camouflage, or that consciousness forms the other actors, or that realities that you cannot see exist over and beyond the physical matter that is so apparent.